My boyfriend's mother humiliated me for months. She ended up losing her son. Colin and I had been together for 2 years when I finally met his mother, Diane. We took our time getting there because he warned me up front. She had strong opinions about his girlfriends. Still, I didn't think it could be that bad. I was a physical therapist at the downtown rehabilitation center, financially independent with my own apartment. My parents owned a small neighborhood bakery that had been around for 20 years. Colin was finishing his medical residency, and we were already talking about moving in together. He chose the restaurant carefully, knowing it was one of Diane's favorites. She arrived 20 minutes late, barely apologized, and immediately looked me up and down. The first thing she said to Colin was, "You didn't tell me she was ethnic. I'm Italian, born in Philadelphia." Dinner didn't improve. She questioned whether physical therapy counted as a real career for someone dating a future doctor. She asked if my parents were legal citizens. She implied I might be with Colin for money, even though I made more than he did as a resident. Every time Colin tried to redirect the conversation, she talked right over him. By the end of the night, I realized this wasn't a bad first impression. It was a warning. After that first dinner, things only got worse. Diane didn't soften once she knew I wasn't going anywhere. Instead, she became more creative. She started calling Colin whenever we were together, casually mentioning that she'd met a lovely girl at her country club that he should really get to know. When Colin told her he was with me, she'd laugh and say, "That's temporary." She showed up unannounced at his apartment while I was there and acted genuinely shocked to see me, as if I were an unexpected guest who'd overstayed her welcome. She told me his ex, Rebecca, was getting divorced and had been asking about him. Rebecca's father, she added pointedly, was a judge, someone who could be very useful for Colin's career. When Colin told her to stop, she brushed it off as harmless conversation. For his birthday, Diane threw a party and gave me the wrong address. By the time Colin called, worried that I hadn't shown up, I was already racing across town. When I arrived 2 hours late, Diane announced to the room that I couldn't even be bothered to show up on time for important events. Colin corrected her in front of everyone. She smiled and said, "Mistakes happen." Soon after, she stopped calling me by my name: Bethany, Catherine, Jessica, anything but Natalie. Colin corrected her every time. She claimed she was bad with names, even though she remembered every nurse, receptionist, and barista she ever met. By then, it was clear this wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. The breaking point came when Colin was on call at the hospital. I was home alone when Diane showed up at my apartment, unannounced, and said we needed a woman-to-woman talk. The moment she stepped inside, I knew this wasn't about peace. She told me Colin would never marry someone like me because I didn't understand their social circle. She said my parents were good people, but they were shopkeepers, and that kind of family connection wouldn't help Colin's career. Then she said my parents had probably pushed me to date above my station because immigrants always want their children to marry up. My parents weren't immigrants, but that didn't matter to her. She said they must be proud that I'd trapped a doctor, but that Colin would eventually wise up. That was when I snapped. I told her she was right about one thing. Colin did deserve better. Not better than me, but better than a lifetime of managing his mother's jealousy and manipulation. I said any woman who married him would be signing up for decades of this behavior, and I wasn't willing to live like that. I told her she won. I was done. She smiled, calm and satisfied, and said she knew I'd see reason eventually. Colin called me about an hour later from the hospital, frantic after receiving texts from his mother claiming I had shown up at her house, said terrible things, and then dumped him. I told him the truth. He drove straight from the hospital to my apartment, still in his scrubs, crying and begging me not to let her win. I told him I loved him, but I was exhausted. I couldn't spend my life fighting his mother for basic respect. We broke up that night. The next day, Diane called Colin to check on him and suggested that maybe now he could reconnect with Rebecca. That was the moment Colin shut down. He stopped answering Diane's calls, picked up extra shifts to avoid going home, and started sleeping in the on-call room even when he wasn't scheduled. His colleagues later told me he lost 15 pounds in the first month. His father tried to get him to come to family dinners, but Colin refused if Diane was there. She insisted he was being dramatic and would get over it. 3 months after we broke up, Colin made a mistake during a procedure from exhaustion. Nothing serious happened, but it was enough to scare everyone. 5 months later, I met James at my cousin's wedding, while Colin was quietly falling apart. James was easy in a way Colin never had been. He was a firefighter, coached Little League on weekends, and his family welcomed me without hesitation. His mother invited me to Sunday dinners as if I'd always belonged there. After everything with Diane, the simplicity felt like relief. Meanwhile, Colin kept unraveling. I heard pieces through mutual friends, how he hadn't been to his parents' house since the breakup, how he was living at the hospital, barely eating. 6 months after we split, Diane started showing up at my workplace. At first, she just sat in her car and watched. Then she came inside and waited. Finally, she approached me in tears, begging me to take Colin back. I stared at her in the rehab center waiting room, my first instinct to call security. Instead, I walked toward the parking lot and she followed, saying Colin hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. When I told her to leave me alone, she grabbed my arm and said he'd made another serious medication error. The hospital was talking about ending his residency. I locked myself in my car and drove home shaking. Part of me wanted Colin to be okay. Another part was furious that Diane thought she could still use me. James held me while I cried, asking what I wanted to do. I didn't have an answer. That night, for the first time since the breakup, I looked at Colin's social media and saw how empty he looked. The next day, Diane called my phone 12 times before I blocked her. When she started calling my workplace instead, my supervisor asked if I needed help dealing with a stalking situation. To make it stop, I agreed to meet Diane at a coffee shop. She showed me photos of Colin on her phone, thin, pale, exhausted, and admitted she hadn't realized how serious his feelings for me were until it was too late. 3 different therapists, she said, had told her she caused this. She begged me to think about helping him, promising she'd he'd stay out of our lives if we got back together. I walked out without answering. That night, I couldn't sleep. I told myself I was dating James because his life was easy, because his family was kind. But easy wasn't the same as right. The next day, I met Hugo, one of Colin's friends from the hospital. I asked him not to sugarcoat anything. He didn't. Colin was barely functioning, working double shifts, sleeping at the hospital, going to therapy, but not actually opening up. Hugo said I was the only person who might get through to him. A week later, lying awake at 2 in the morning, I called Colin. He answered on the 5th ring. Hearing my name in his voice broke something open in me. We talked for 15 minutes, and I realized I never stopped loving him. I had just learned how to survive without him. After that call, everything I'd been avoiding came rushing back. I told James about speaking to Colin and about how Diane's visit had stirred up feelings I thought were gone. He listened quietly and didn't get angry, but I could see the sadness settle in his face. He said he appreciated my honesty and asked for space so I could figure out what I really wanted. A week later, I moved back into my own apartment. Frank called me 3 days after that. Colin's father asked to meet for coffee, something he'd never done before. He admitted he'd failed by staying neutral while Diane pushed me away. He explained her obsession with status, her fear of instability, and how his silence had enabled her. He told me Diane was in real therapy now and that he was prepared to choose his son over his marriage if she refused to change. Still unsure, I went to therapy myself. My therapist asked what I wanted, not what felt safest. The answer scared me. I wanted Colin. What terrified me wasn't loving him, but the possibility that even love wouldn't be enough if nothing truly changed. When I met Colin for coffee again, he looked fragile but honest. He took full responsibility for not protecting our relationship and told me he was learning how deeply his mother had controlled his life. He didn't ask me to take him back, only to stay in contact while he worked on himself. I agreed cautiously, knowing I needed proof, not promises. Over the next few weeks, Colin and I stayed in touch. We met for coffee, texted about ordinary things, and I watched him slowly come back to life. He gained weight, started going to the gym again, and picked up his guitar. His therapist said he was making real progress, and I could see it for myself. Then Diane called me and asked if she could apologize in person. I didn't trust it, so I called Colin immediately. He said his therapist thought a supervised apology might help, and he offered to be there. I agreed, but only with him present. At the restaurant, Diane apologized point by point. Her comments about my family, the birthday party, showing up at my apartment. Some of it felt rehearsed, some of it genuine. She promised to respect boundaries, even if it meant limited contact. But I noticed she kept glancing at Colin for approval. When I pointed it out, she stiffened, then admitted she was still trying to break that habit. Later, Colin and I talked it through. He acknowledged his mother's progress was imperfect, but told me he was committed to enforcing boundaries no matter how uncomfortable it became. For the first time, I believed him. Slowly, carefully, we began dating again, with rules written down and consequences clearly defined. Dating Colin again felt familiar, but different. We moved slowly, checking in constantly instead of assuming everything was fine. He kept his therapy appointments, even when things were going well, and he followed through every time Diane tested the boundaries. When she made subtle comments or tried to guilt him, he shut it down and reduced contact without hesitation. Frank backed him up each time, refusing to smooth things over for Diane's comfort. Colin's improvement showed everywhere. The hospital cleared him to return to full duties, and his confidence came back with it. He laughed more, slept at home, and talked about the future without fear. Watching him heal made me believe this wasn't temporary. Eventually, we decided to move in together. Before we signed the lease, Colin sat his parents down and set firm rules. No surprise visits, no key, no involvement without invitation. Diane protested, but Frank shut it down. When she finally visited our new place, she stayed 30 minutes and left without crossing a single line. I met James one last time to return his things. He had moved on, and seeing that brought relief instead of guilt. That weekend, Colin took me to a quiet cabin in the mountains. Under the stars, he asked me to marry him, promising our life would always be ours to protect. I said yes, believing he was finally strong enough to keep that promise. A year after the breakup that nearly destroyed us, Colin and I were planning our wedding. We chose a small spring venue and kept everything simple. Diane struggled with her limited role, calling with suggestions about guest lists and flowers, but Colin shut her down every time. Frank stepped in when she pushed too hard, making it clear that respecting boundaries was the only way she stayed in our lives. Our routine settled into something steady. Monthly dinners with his parents, always in public, always with an end time. Diane was still in therapy, still imperfect, but learning. When she slipped, Colin corrected it immediately, and I no longer felt alone in holding the line. We built a home together, shared routines, quiet mornings, plans that belonged only to us. Trust came back slowly, reinforced by actions instead of words. Watching Colin choose himself and us again and again healed something I hadn't realized was still broken. Our life isn't flawless, and it probably never will be with Diane involved, but it's honest, it's protected, it's ours.